Welcome back to Guido's Chop Shop, the second best yaw blaster channel on the tubes, and I'm continuing on with my Lonex build. You can see here I've got all the parts laid out. You may notice I've added to the equation this aluminium cylinder head here, and also a tappet plate because you need them, among other things. But now I'm going to start putting all these together into a gearbox. So now starting with the empty gearbox, this one does have the bearings already pushed into it. Let's start building. Now, as I mentioned, this is a War Interest 3.0 box. I am waiting for something a little bit better to arrive to put this stuff into, but for now I'm going to build it into this so that we've got some idea of what's going on at least. Starting with the cutoff lever. Now, cutoff lever just goes in there, and then just screws in with this little screw here. And the purpose of this is obviously to lift the trigger trolley off the top of the trigger. So this this hook actually hooks underneath there, so that lifts that trolley off. Bad example. Speaking of which, let's get this hooked up in here now. Now, before this goes in, it's probably going to be a good idea to get some wiring in there. I'm going to solder some wires onto these contacts here. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, get my soldering iron tip tinned, just a dab of solder on there just to wet it up, and then I'm going to just apply that tinned iron to the contact surface and then apply a bit of solder to it, just like that. That's what we call wetting or tinning, or both. And I'm going to do the same on this contact tab here. Just apply the heat for a little moment and then add a dab of solder there, just enough to wet it up. You don't have to hold the iron on there for forever. You don't want to do that because you can melt the plastic if you hold it on there for ages and ages. Just a couple of seconds. Now, for what it's worth, I've got my iron set to 350. Actually, I've got it set to 360 degrees. I could probably knock that back a bit down at 350. I usually solder around 350. If you don't have a adjustable temperature soldering iron, get one. They're not expensive. Temperature adjustment, most important. I got here the silver wire from the kit. I'm just going to trim off the insulation there, and then I'm going to tin the end of this wire too. So I'll just put that in focus for you, hopefully. And again, soldering iron tip cleaned, tinned. Just apply the heat with the iron to the wire and then feed in a little bit of solder. You should see the solder actually just flow onto the wire like that. Don't need too much. If anything, I was a little bit excessive, but that's okay. Trying to get a good angle with the soldering iron and the camera tripod. Alright, so we've got both tinned, clean iron, tin the iron again. Let's see if I can do this around the tripod. Alright, if you're not having to work around a tripod, you should end up with something like this. And then of course, we're going to do the same for the other wire. Now it doesn't necessarily matter which wires you put on here. There's various ways that this can work. This is a switch, so there's no real polarity or anything involved with this switch. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm just going to do the negatives. In fact, I'm just going to put a little bit of a bend on this one. Like this. So I can come in from this angle like this. Alright, so what you should have there, if you can see it, obviously you don't want these two wires contacting each other, so there is the insulation there, so they're not contacting each other, otherwise you'll be firing all of the time. But basically what's happening here is you got one there, and then your trolley gets jammed in between them, and that completes the circuit there. So what I'm going to do with these two wires, so I run them down, and I'm going to use these as my negative wires. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can have switch negative or you can have switch positive. I like to do switch negative because a lot of MOSFETs are switch negative because that's the way they work. So I like to wire my trigger trolley switch negative so that way if I want to upgrade to a MOSFET later on, my wiring's already pretty much done for it, I just need to get it in there, sort of thing. It's neither here nor there. I just prefer to switch negative. Some manufacturers are positive, some are negative. It doesn't matter, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Alright, and so here we go. The trigger mechanism's going to pop in there. The trolley will probably should have been in before I clicked it in. Make things a bit easier. There we go. Alright, now there's going to be the spring that connects this trolley to this bar here. That's the return spring. So when you release, this will fling back so that the thing doesn't stay on all the time. So if you have trouble where you pull the trigger and it just stays on, it's possible that your spring here might have died or something else has gone wrong. So we'll pop that spring in next. Actually, before I pop that spring in, there is a screw which fixes this all in place there. Stops that from popping out, so I'll pop that screw in first. Now I'll get to the spring. Alright, so that spring's in now. So that will pull your trolley back after it's released. Incidentally, I'll put the spring on the reverse of this too. This is for the selector plate, so it just goes on that little rocker that we installed earlier. So squeeze it down in there, and it basically goes between the selector plate and the rocker. There you go, like that. Now with the wire run, just run it down here through these little channels. I like to run, this, being that this is a slightly heavier gauge wire, it may have a bit of difficulty routing into the channels. So I've got some chain nose pliers here. These are rounded on the ends, so you don't kink the wires. Just use them to put a bend in certain places so that I can get the right route. So what I want to do here is I want to route the one that goes back to the battery on the bottom, so that it stays down low, so it stays away from this pinion gear when the motor is placed in there. So that should be nice and low like that, and then this one will only have to run down here, because this is going to be the negative for the motor. It only has to come out here. Now again, the way you run this depends on your decisions, your choices that you've made. I've decided to switch negative, so for me the negative is going to be coming out here, closest to the front of the grip. If you would have done positive triggered, then this would have been the positive coming out the front. Now the only difference this will make is with your motor, whether it basically goes this way or that way. Doesn't have any real effect on the operation whether the motor's this way or that way, but it just, the location of your positive terminal and your negative terminal will swap. The direction of the motor is going to spin the same way so long as you get your positive and negative the correct way, so it doesn't matter too much as long as you go with the same standard that you've chosen to follow and stick with that one throughout the whole way. Your positive wire in this case is just going to come straight down the back here, so it's not going to have to cross. That way you only got one wire ever crossing, so you've only got one wire that could potentially be snagged by the pinion, but if you keep it low enough you should be good. It should be alright there. Check with your trigger to just make sure that up around here your wires aren't in the way. You want to have good operation here. You don't want these wires getting caught. You don't want them getting in the way. That should be all good. Among the various springs in the spring kit was this one here. This is the spring for your mechanical safety. It goes in there, and then your safety goes, oh hang on, make sure that you've got it lined up correctly on the other side. This is let's see if I got a good shot there. This little tab here. So make sure that that is pointing upwards on the other side. And then the first little tab here just tucks in behind there. You should be able to get the other part to hook over top of this, and then it pops down in there. Now the idea behind this is when your trigger is in there, so you can operate down here, but when the bar is up here it stops, physically stops the trigger, so that's your physical safety. It's just a single little screw which goes in there. You can see that spring hooks over the top there, and the other end at the front there. Now the rest is all pretty easy, pretty straightforward. I've got my nice aluminium O-ringed cylinder head and nozzle there. It's just going to go into the end of the cylinder. I will pop just a little bit of oil just on these O-rings, just to make assembly a bit easier, and also to help them seal nice into that cylinder. I just put a bit of oil on and rotate it around a bit, just so you get a nice seat in there. Beautiful. Now I've got the tappet plate here as well. This is just a standard war interest tappet plate, because this is the one that goes with this gearbox, and that just pops in there. And of course you've got the spring which is in here. A lot of people were kind of asking me, why am I doing this in a war interest gearbox that I pulled out of the garbage bin, as opposed to some sort of CNC machine box. This is going to reside in my Scar 1000 for the time being, but I am still waiting on another company to finish their V2 boxes so I can put that in. But for now, this is the box that goes in the Scar, so it'll be a nice easy fit. Alright, of course next we have all the good stuff. The gears. Now of course you'll have to shim all these to spec. Which is done as follows. Alright, now the anti-reverse catch is always a tricky one. I might leave that till last. I'll get the piston in. Could have done this earlier on when I was doing the cylinder. It probably would have made things a bit easier, but is what it is. I might just pop that out a bit. Just make sure all your little slots line up there, so that it can slide in nicely there. Trigger spring I might handle while we're here as well. It's always a little bit of a tricky one. So the bendy bit on a V2 goes into the hole like that on the trigger, and it just sort of sits like that, and then the front flat bit pushes down into the bottom of the gearbox there, and then it just sits there. It's actually quite simple on a V2. It's generally I think it's the Gen 8s and J9s that are a pain, because they look like that V2, but you actually put them in backwards. So that's another story. Alright, anti-reverse I think is the last one we got to go. A lot of people have trouble with this one as well. My recommendation is, if you do have trouble with this, get a magnet. I've got this magnet, which is, it's actually out of an old hard disk drive, but it's a nice big strong magnet. You can pick them up from JCar or wherever. But yeah, so the anti-reverse spring, I don't know if you can see this. Alright, so your anti-reverse spring sits on like that with the little hook bending over the top of the ratchet arm. Then, if you take your bevel gear out, it sits in there with the flat part of the spring pushing up against here, and then you bend it down against the tension of the spring and pop your bevel gear back in so that it sits in the little ratchet spots in the bevel. That one just went in real nice, so I don't need to use a magnet or anything, but if you do, what you do is you pop your magnet underneath like that, and that just holds all the gears back against the magnet. It holds the anti-reverse and everything. It holds them all in place, so you can, move the thing around and put your top half on, and it's just not going to move around on you. Now is probably as good a time as any to run the positive wire. Probably could have done it before I put all the gears in, but it was it's not a big deal. It just runs down here, so just as long as you remember to put it in before you put the gearbox together. Sweet. Okay, I've just greased these up with the Lonex grease, and one of the things I've just noticed that I can't say I've noticed with a lot of the cheaper components that I've used in the past, just the generic stuff you get from AliExpress and that sort of thing. While good in their own right, I've used a lot of them and they're okay, but compared to these Lonex ones, like, the tolerances on these are really good. So all these gears are just sitting in here. There's no magnets, nothing. The anti-reverse catch just seems to hold in there. I can actually rotate these gears and the anti-reverse catch is working. It's sitting there. It's not popping out. The trigger is sitting there. The trigger's not flying out from just being sitting there. Usually I'm used to having to hold everything together while I'm trying to put it together. And checking things like your tooth engagement on the piston here is real nice and easy to do, because the piston is like, it's nice and tight. The tolerances are good. Look at this. There's no movement there in that piston. If you were to use, say, like, I don't know, a generic something like this. I don't know. This is something I've pulled, some generic Chinese piston. I find that these things just sort of wobble in there when they're in place, and you can't really do things like checking your tooth engagement correctly without having a little bit of guesswork involved, because the piston just like wobbles back and forth inside there. So like there's too much slop to actually be able to tell whether you've got, a good engagement or not. And just the way these Lonex gears are, the tolerances are so nice that everything's just so nice and smooth and everything fits together. So, I mean, I'm really impressed with that. That's something, if nothing else, that's something that I've noticed, which has made even just putting this gearbox together really easy, because things are just staying where you put them. So that's a plus. That's a plus in my book. Tactical Edge Hobbies gave me this Lonex stuff to test, and I mean, they're not paying me to make a video and say how great these are or anything like that. I'm genuinely impressed by the tolerances and the way all this stuff sits together. Let's put this together. Let's put the gearbox shell together, and hopefully get this into a blaster at some stage. So just make sure that the tappet plate is sitting down flush. Everything seems to be sitting in nicely in its places, so should be pretty easy just to pop this shell on. I like to sort of start from the back end so that you get the anti-reverse catch first, because that seems to be the one that's the hardest thing to keep in place. Make sure none of the wires are pinched or anything. Alright, just got to get some screws in that, just in 1 second. Screws in. Second last component to go in is the Lonex M110 spring. Just pop it in the back there. Alright. And of course the last component is the Lonex A2 motor, but that will go in when it goes into a blaster. And unfortunately, that is all I have time for today. I promise I'm not doing this to milk content from this build. I am genuinely incredibly busy and I've run out of time. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get notifications for the next part of this build, and you can do all those good things like buy a patch from messaging me on Facebook, or buy me a coffee if you would like to support my channel and my content. Alright, thank you very much. Peace.